On October 6, 2025, 11:23 a.m., the day over Luhansk Oblast looked ordinary. There was just the wind and the distant sound of logistics rolling through occupied roads. There were no flares, no sudden roars, just the small sounds of a military rear area doing its work. Then, for reasons that would only be clear later, an antenna mast began to sing. Within minutes, Ukrainian screens lit up, radio frequencies spiked, GPS fixes jittered, and somewhere in the occupied zone, a massive R330ZH Zhitel electronic warfare station had switched on. This was a rare, expensive monster that could jam satellite links, scramble GPS navigation, and blank radios across dozens of kilometers. It was the kind of system commanders feared because it was costly, complex, and capable of turning whole pockets of the sky into dead air. At 11:23 a.m., drones hit it. That single moment alone was the destruction of one of Russia's most valuable electronic brains. The Zhitel wasn't a crate of ammo, it was a mobile command of silence, able to blind drones and break coordination. Since the full-scale invasion began, only a few dozen of these had been confirmed destroyed. They were not common targets. They were high-value, high-payoff prizes. This attack was not random. The scouts had monitored its transmissions, analysts had mapped its footprint, and a drone strike team had been put on a tight schedule to strike at the moment it broadcast its power. But the question is not only that the Zhitel fell, it's what came next. How Ukraine found it, how the strike was timed while the jammer was live, and how knocking one of these systems out changed the battlefield for hours and days afterward. At 11:23 a.m., the jammer that once made Ukrainian skies unsafe went silent, and for once, the silence belonged to Kiev. Let me take you through this highly planned surgical strike that rattled one of Russia's most dangerous tools, and for a few critical hours, gave Kiev the skies back. At 8:30 a.m. that morning, the SBU's signal cell had already been awake for hours. Analysts had spent the week stitching together a picture of intermittent interference, timestamps, frequency sweeps, and tiny differences in the way the noise rose and fell. Those patterns were the fingerprints they used to identify a Zhitel, the R330ZH by its operating features. These included a heavy carrier, wideband energy on GNSS and GSM adjacent bands, and enough power to upset airborne navigation for dozens of kilometers. The team treated the signature like a living thing. They watched how it breathed and waited for it to inhale in a way that would give them a throat to cut off. By 9:12 a.m., the radio frequency history had been plotted out on wall screens. The analysts ran a history playback. They went through previous activations, how long each burst lasted, meteorological notes that suggested which launch windows favored the jammer's thermal management, and unit movement logs obtained from human intelligence. The pattern suggested two tactical truths. First, the Zhitel did not transmit continuously. It cycled to preserve power and avoid basic direction-finding issues. Second, when it broadcast, it typically did so around mass drone launches or when Russian commanders expected Ukrainian ISR to be active. That predictable on-off rhythm was the opening the planners needed. Around 9:40 a.m., the operations director authorized a distributed localization sweep. Multiple receiving stations, some fixed and some mobile, switched to more accurate angle of arrival AOA and time difference of arrival TDOA modes. They used multilateration, basically the radio version of crossing flashlight beams. Stations in different places measured the jammer's bearing or signal timing, and analysts drew those lines on the map until they struck. The result wasn't a perfect dot, but a firing box, an area, sometimes a few hundred meters wide, where the signal was strongest. That level of accuracy was enough. Interceptor crews took that box and, using handheld RF meters, rising signal strength, and visual clues, such as smoke, generators, and trucks, hunted the transmitter down. While the RF teams ran the numbers, the planners prepared the strike like a surgeon prepping instruments. They cued two types of drones. The first were winged interceptors, small but fast, built to hit hard. They carried focused disruption charges meant to cut the feed lines on parabolic dishes or fry amplifier racks. The second group consisted of FPV multi-rotor, which were cheap but used as tools to smash diesel generators, slice cable trunks, or ram fragile antenna arrays. The tactic was a little bold, sure, but it was efficient. It used expendable multi-rotors to punch holes into the site, then sent the winged craft in to finish the critical gear. Recon confirmed the likely emitter site at 10:05 a.m. Analysts matched a fenced yard and a trailer mast on recent satellite images to border guard aerial photos and local social posts showing recent vehicle activity. A legal officer flagged nearby civilian risks, so the package was adjusted. There were low fragmentation disruptors, timing that avoided darkness dependence, and strict rules to spare unrelated telecom nodes. When the jammer came alive at 10:37, the RF picture became clearer. Bearings converged on a ridge by the road, and the team narrowed a firing box roughly the size of a city block. Launch order followed at 10:45. Interceptors moved from different strips and rooftops to confuse enemy watchers. Pilots flew on a shared comms network that streamed live spectrum waterfalls, bearing cursors and a tone that got higher as they closed on the emitter. The interceptors did not fly blind. Their navigation stacks had been well trained for GNSS denial. Inertial measurement units carried them through blank patches. Barometric altimeters kept altitude safe. Optical flow and visual odometry provided terminal alignment when satellites could not be relied on. But the absolute sensor was a radio. Inside the aircraft, spectrum analyzers turned signal strength into direction clues. The stronger the radio noise, the narrower the target area. Pilots chased that signal like hunters tracking a campfire glow in the dark. At 11:03 a.m., one of the winged interceptors noticed a sudden spike. The radio waves grew louder and dirtier, filled with extra static and harmonic noise. That usually meant one thing: someone had just powered up a high-energy amplifier. The crew locked onto that signal immediately. They shifted course and called in FPV drone teams for close-range strikes. This kicked off a move the pilots jokingly called the two-pincer RF dance. The idea was simple but deadly. The winged aircraft kept pressing the enemy operator, forcing them to keep changing antenna directions and power levels to stay connected. Meanwhile, the FPV drones, fast and almost impossible to spot, attacked the gear on the edges, such as power cables, generators, and control stations. That chaos distracted the operator and left the central system exposed. The FPVs used a move known as window punching. They skimmed low across tree lines, zigzagging to dodge gunfire, then shot upward at the last second to hit generators and cable lines. Each strike was carefully calculated, the kind of precision that only came from hundreds of practice runs and countless simulations. The winged aircraft, flying at speeds of around 220 to 300 kilometers per hour, had a different job. They carried small kinetic disruptors that were designed not to blow things up, but to disable them cleanly. The disruptors slammed into the satellite dish's feed horns and mast joints, damaging them just enough that the entire setup would be useless unless rebuilt from scratch. It was efficient, surgical warfare with no massive explosions and no stray shrapnel. At 11:17 a.m., one winged interceptor hit the main mast directly. The live camera feed flickered, but caught everything. A flash of blue, a spray of sparks, and then darkness as the disruptor tore through the coaxial cables feeding the jammer. A few seconds later, an FPV drone smashed into the diesel generator compound, causing a minor explosion that set control panels on fire. Back in the command room, the change was instant. On the spectrum display, the thick bar of noise that had covered the screen suddenly dropped and was replaced by a thin, clean line of silence. The radios that had been filled with screeching interference went completely quiet, as if someone had turned them off mid-sentence. And just like that, the region's GNSS satellite navigation came back online. Drones that had been flying half-blind regained their autonomous controls. Artillery observers who relied on satellite data saw their targeting corrections snap into place again. Precise and steady. The effect was immediate and decisive. For the first time in hours, the battlefield's technology was breathing again. Systems could trust their satellites. Missions that had been delayed or manually guided could now move ahead smoothly. In tactical terms, it was simple, but in war, victories like this are the ones that change everything. Moscow's response came quickly and, as expected, loudly. Within hours of the strike, reports began flooding in from occupied Luhansk. Russian crews started relocating secondary emitter vehicles, trying to keep their electronic warfare coverage intact. They activated fake transmitters at new coordinates, hoping to confuse Ukrainian sensors, and surrounded their surviving equipment with escort drones. Orders went out to nearby Panzer S-1 anti-air units and mobile air defense teams to move closer to the damaged site. It was a predictable move, but also a desperate one. Russia now faced an impossible trade-off. Keeping the jammers running meant risking exposure to another strike, while shutting them down meant losing their most valuable defense tool, to block Ukrainian drones and blind satellite signals. Either option costs them control. Ukraine's operators were ready for this game of deception. After the strike, they kept their receivers tuned to every possible frequency, listening for signs of fake transmitters. The decoys were easy to spot once you knew what to look for. Their power output was weaker, their frequency sweeps were uneven, and their harmonic patterns didn't match those of the original Zhitel system. They were loud, but not smart, and their primary purpose was to buy Russia time. Ukrainian analysts didn't fall for it. They knew these signals were designed to distract them from the fundamental objective. The Russians also experimented with something far more complex: standoff jamming. Instead of using ground-based systems, they tried to use aircraft or coastal platforms to project jamming signals from a safe distance. This approach kept their equipment out of reach of small interceptors, but it came at a high price. Aircraft needed to stay airborne longer, which burned fuel and revealed their position to radar. Every hour of jamming became an hour of risk and expense. The tactic was effective, but it was not sustainable, and everyone in Moscow's command room knew it. The after-action report from Kiev's command center that afternoon read like a textbook on modern electronic warfare. It explained that the operation's success came from three major strengths working together: a tight network of direction-finding sensors, mass-produced interceptors, and strong, encrypted communication between every unit involved. The direction-finding network stretched across multiple layers of the battlefield. Small receivers near the front picked up first signals, mobile vans inland provided cross-bearings, and long-range arrays deep in Ukrainian territory verified and refined the readings. The interceptors themselves were cheap, modular, and adaptable. They could be reconfigured from weapon carriers to sensor platforms in under an hour, and none of it would have worked without solid communications, the invisible web that connected analysts, drone pilots, and command officers into a single living system. Buried in the report were stories that reminded everyone that behind all the signal work and analysis were people. Pilots described how they had trained endlessly to recognize the specific radio fingerprint of a Zhitel jammer. RF analysts wrote about the night they finally caught a clean signal that lasted long enough for an accurate location fix. Some of them stayed awake for hours after that, waiting for confirmation that the interceptors were airborne. One legal officer recalled a moment when they had to abort a mission just seconds before launch because civilians were spotted moving close to the target zone. Those tiny human decisions, made under enormous pressure, changed the operation's final success more than any algorithm ever could. The forensic analysis that followed revealed how Ukraine's teams had actually managed to find the Zhitel in the first place. It wasn't just through radio signals. The system's power amplifiers generated a heat signature that stood out during early morning satellite scans. Even in the cold October air, the warmth from the generator trailers glowed faintly on thermal images. Pilots used all of this, and even the moving shadow of the antenna mast, to fine-tune their seeker drones before the attack. In a war increasingly fought by sensors and algorithms, these small physical clues still made all the difference. A few degrees of heat, a thin trail of smoke, or a noise pattern on a spectrogram could reveal the location of equipment worth millions. By 12:30 p.m. that afternoon, the command room in Kyiv received the confirmed damage report. The antenna mast of the R330ZH Zhitel system was destroyed. The feed lines were cut clean through. The power amplifiers had burned out inside their casing. Satellite imagery later showed a dark patch of scorched earth where the mast once stood. For several hours after the strike, Ukraine's drones and artillery systems operated without any interference. Their navigation signals returned to full strength, allowing missions that had been delayed or rerouted earlier in the day to proceed with remarkable accuracy. On a larger scale, it sent a powerful message. Russia's most sophisticated electronic weapons could be hunted, tracked, and destroyed by drones that cost a fraction of their price. In the days that followed, Moscow began rethinking its tactics. They spread out their electronic warfare systems to make them harder to target, strengthened the ones that remained, and started experimenting with new methods, such as shifting frequencies more often and using mobile power sources to disguise their heat signatures from satellites. Kyiv adapted just as quickly. Ukraine began investing heavily in denser direction-finding networks, stronger and more secure communications, and faster production lines for interceptor drones. Western defense experts soon took notice. The math of the war was changing. Building thousands of $5,000 interceptors suddenly mattered just as much as owning a single $4 million missile system. The strike on the Zhitel did not end the electronic war between the two sides, but it changed its rhythm. On a specific morning, Ukraine showed that the electromagnetic spectrum itself could become a battlefield. It proved that signals, frequencies, and radio waves could be targeted, contested, and won through patience. By 11:23 a.m., the ridge in Luhansk had gone quiet. The Zhitel jammer, once Russia's shield against drones and signals, was nothing but smoke and twisted metal. For Ukraine, it was proof that accuracy could beat power, and patience could break even the strongest defenses. For Russia, it was a warning. If their most advanced jammers could be found and destroyed, what else was truly safe?